On January 7, 2026, in a secure conference room 3 levels beneath the West Wing, Donald Trump signed Executive Order 14,152. Is a document classified. Until moments ago, does something no American president has attempted since the occupation of Japan in 1945. It establishes a temporary U.S. administrative authority over a sovereign nation's natural resources. The target is Venezuela's shattered oil infrastructure, the largest proven reserves on Earth, currently producing less crude than Kansas. The mechanism is unprecedented, a 5-year reconstruction mandate, operating under what the White House calls stabilization governance, and what critics are already calling economic colonialism. Within 72 hours of Maduro's extraction, American petroleum engineers from Houston were wheeled up toward Maracaibo. The implications extend far beyond the Caribbean. This isn't regime change followed by withdrawal. This is regime change followed by direct American management of a nation's economic life. And the world is watching to see if Washington is rebuilding a partner or creating a protectorate. The executive order runs 47 pages, but 3 clauses matter most. First, the establishment of the Venezuelan Reconstruction Authority, a hybrid entity staffed by U.S. Treasury officials, Department of Energy specialists, and Venezuelan opposition technocrats handpicked by María Corina Machado. This body will have direct operational control over PDVSA, the state oil company that Chavez gutted and Maduro bled dry. Second, a revenue-sharing formula. 60% of oil proceeds go to Venezuelan debt repayment and infrastructure reconstruction, 25% to direct cash transfers to Venezuelan citizens, 15% to U.S. operational costs. Third, and most controversially, American military protection for all oil facilities, pipelines, and refineries for the duration of the mandate. The legal justification rests on a framework developed by State Department lawyers over 18 months. Venezuela is classified as a failed state with absent governance, and the operation is framed as humanitarian intervention to prevent regional collapse. The precedent they cite is the UN mission in East Timor, but the scale and unilateralism are entirely different. Trump's team learned from Iraq's mistakes. They were not disbanding Venezuela, East bureaucracy, or purging every Chavasta from government. Instead, they're running a parallel administration focused solely on energy, letting Venezuelan institutions handle everything else, at least for now. Lake Maracaibo is where Venezuelan oil began in 1914, when the Zumaquan well blew in with such force that it took 9 days to cap. At its peak in the 1970s, this single basin produced 2.4 million barrels daily. Today it produces 140,000, and most of that crude is so contaminated with water and sediment it's barely refinable. The Americans are starting here, because Maracaibo represents both the greatest potential and the starkest warning of what 2 decades of neglect have wrought. The lake itself is an ecological disaster. Zone oil slicks coat 30% of the surface, and fishermen who once fed their families now scavenge metal from abandoned rigs. The infrastructure reads like a maintenance horror story. 18,000 wells, of which perhaps 3,000 still function. Pipelines installed in the 1950s that were rated for 25-year lifespans, now approaching 75 years without replacement. Pumping stations running on generators because the electrical grid fails daily. The first wave of American engineers arrived at Maracaibo's Ambrosio Plaza on January 9, to 127 specialists from Halliburton, Schlumberger, and Baker Hughes, protected by a Marine Security Detachment. Their initial assessment leaked to industry publications. Estimates $23 billion in 7 years to restore the basin to 1.5 million barrels daily. But there's a faster option that's causing fierce internal debate. Focus on 500 high potential wells, inject modern horizontal drilling technology, and hit 800,000 barrels within 18 months. It's a triage approach. Save what can be saved quickly, abandon the rest. The decision matters because global oil markets are watching. Brent crude jumped $4 per barrel on news of the operation, then fell back as traders realized production won't materialize overnight. The Maracaibo Basin will determine whether this gamble pays dividends or drowns in complexity. On January 8, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov stood before cameras in Moscow and delivered a statement notably devoid of military threats. He condemned the operation as a brazen violation of international law and called for an emergency UN Security Council session. But the rhetoric was measured, almost resigned. This matters because Russia has $17 billion in outstanding Venezuelan debt, owns stakes in 5 major oil fields through Rosneft, and has treated Caracas as a strategic foothold in the Western Hemisphere for 15 years. The muted response reveals a cold calculation happening in the Kremlin. Venezuela under Maduro was a sinking asset, a money pit that consumed resources without delivering meaningful geopolitical returns. Russian military advisors stationed there were increasingly isolated, and the debt repayment schedule had become a fantasy. Putin's strategists are now gaming out a different scenario. If American investment actually restores Venezuelan oil production, and if the revenue-sharing formula holds, Moscow might eventually recover a portion of what it's owed. The alternative: watching Venezuela spiral into complete state failure guarantees total loss. Russian state media is running dual narratives: official condemnation for domestic and international consumption, but analytical pieces suggesting that Western capital intervention might stabilize the situation. Behind closed doors, Rosneft executors are reportedly exploring whether they can negotiate with the Venezuelan Reconstruction Authority to maintain operational stakes in their existing fields. The price would be implicit acceptance of the American framework. China faces a parallel calculus with even higher stakes: $60 billion in loans for oil agreements that have delivered almost nothing since 2019. Beijing's official response has been carefully calibrated silence, a diplomatic holding pattern while they assess whether this American gambit creates opportunities or closes doors. The great powers are watching, waiting, and calculating whether to resist or quietly reposition themselves around this new reality. María Corina Machado spent 17 years preparing for this moment, but not for this version of it. On January 10th, she addressed the nation from a hastily arranged podium in eastern Caracas. Flanked by members of the Transitional Council, her message walked a razor's edge: gratitude for Maduro's removal, full support for oil sector reconstruction, but visible discomfort with the extent of American control. The opposition leader who once advocated for complete privatization now finds herself managing a nationalist backlash she didn't anticipate. Street protests erupted in 3 cities: not pro-Maduro demonstrations, but angry crowds waving Venezuelan flags and chanting sovereignty. These aren't Chavastas mourning their leader. They are ordinary Venezuelans who oppose the dictatorship but recoil at what looks like American management of their national patrimony. Machado's political coalition is fracturing along predictable lines. The pragmatists argue that sovereignty means nothing if the nation has no functioning economy, that Venezuelan expertise alone cannot rebuild what took 25 years to destroy, and that accepting temporary American administration is the price of survival. The nationalists counter that the revenue formula is 60% to debt, and reconstruction effectively makes Venezuela a debtor nation, working off foreign obligations while its people remain impoverished. Despite the 25% direct transfer provision, the mathematics are brutal, even at optimistic production targets. Venezuelans would receive perhaps $40 monthly per capita while watching American companies extract resources their grandfathers nationalized in 1976. Machado needs the Americans to succeed because failure means chaos and potential civil war. But she also needs to demonstrate independence, to prove she's not merely Washington's administrator. Her solution is to demand accelerated timelines, push for results in 3 years, not 5, and insist on Venezuelan management training programs so nationals can eventually assume operational control. Whether Trump's team will accommodate this balancing act remains uncertain. The Colombian border is 1,378 miles of porous jungle, mountain passes, and river crossings where the Venezuelan state ceased to exist years ago. Here the own guerrillas, FARC dissidents, and the Tehran de Aragua criminal syndicate built a parallel economy worth an estimated $4 billion annually: cocaine trafficking, illegal mining, extortion, and fuel smuggling. These groups didn't just benefit from Maduro's weakness, they were integrated into his survival strategy. High-ranking Venezuelan military officers facilitated their operations in exchange for cuts that kept the regime solvent when oil revenues collapsed. Now those arrangements are disintegrating, and the armed groups face an existential question: negotiate with the new order or fight it. On January 20th, explosions damaged pipelines in Zulia state near the Colombian border, crude but effective sabotage that shut down 40,000 barrels of daily flow. No group claimed responsibility, but the message was unmistakable. American engineers working in border regions now operate under threat levels typically reserved for active war zones. The nightmare scenario isn't a conventional military challenge. It's asymmetric warfare designed to make reconstruction impossibly expensive and dangerous. Blow up a pipeline, ambush a convoy, kidnap a foreign technician. Each incident raises insurance costs, spooks investors, and demonstrates that controlling Caracas doesn't mean controlling Venezuela. The Pentagon deployed 1,200 troops to Venezuela primarily for this contingency, but they're rediscovering what the Soviets learned in Afghanistan and Americans relearned in Iraq. You cannot secure a hostile countryside with limited forces. The Trump administration is now pressuring Colombia's President Petro to launch joint operations against cross-border militants, but Petro, ideologically sympathetic to the Latin American left, is dragging his feet. Intelligence reports suggest some cartel leaders are exploring negotiation channels, offering to cease attacks in exchange for amnesty and economic integration. The question is whether Washington can stomach cutting deals with narco-traffickers to save an oil reconstruction project. The Paraguana refinery complex on Venezuela's northwestern peninsula was once the world's second-largest refining operation, processing 955,000 barrels daily and transforming heavy Venezuelan crude into gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel. By 2024, it was processing barely 40,000 barrels. Operating at 4% capacity, a monument to catastrophic mismanagement. Thousands of valves leak. Catalyst systems are contaminated beyond recovery, and entire distillation units stand idle because replacement parts were never ordered. The complex employed 8,000 workers in 2010. Today, 1,200 show up irregularly. Many drunk or high decay because their monthly salary equals $6, and there's no actual work to perform. This is what American petroleum engineers encountered on January 14th, when they arrived to conduct detailed assessments. The initial reports are grimmer than anticipated. Restoring Paraguana to even 400,000 barrels daily would require $8 billion in complete reconstruction of 3 major processing units. The alternative, building an entirely new refinery using modular construction techniques, might actually be faster and cheaper, but it means writing off decades of infrastructure investment. The decision has geopolitical implications beyond engineering. If the U.S. rebuilds Venezuelan refining capacity, it reduces American dependence on imports, while simultaneously creating a Western Hemisphere energy hub that could supply Caribbean and South American markets, currently served by U.S. Gulf Coast refineries. This threatens domestic American refining interests, and lobbying groups in Texas and Louisiana are already pushing back. Secretary of Energy Chris Wright faces competing pressures: maximize Venezuelan production to flood global markets and suppress prices, or carefully manage output to avoid craring the American shale industry. The decision framework is further complicated by the reality that Venezuela's extra-heavy crude requires specialized refining infrastructure that only a handful of facilities worldwide can handle. Paraguana was built specifically for this purpose, making its restoration, however expensive, potentially irreversible. On January 16th, the Venezuelan bolivar experienced its steepest single-day devaluation in 3 years, losing 47% against the dollar in unofficial markets. The paradox is striking. The announcement of massive American investment in oil reconstruction should have stabilized the currency, but instead it triggered panic. The mechanism reveals how deeply broken Venezuela's economy has become. For 5 years, Maduro maintained a fictitious official exchange rate, while the real economy operated on black market dollars and cryptocurrency. Regime-connected elites profited from the spread, buying bolivars at the official rate and selling dollars at 200 times that price. The new Reconstruction Authority just announced its eliminating the dual rate system entirely and moving to a managed float, backed by oil revenue guarantees. This destroys the arbitrage schemes that kept what remained of Venezuela's business class solvent. Importers who built models around currency manipulation suddenly face transparent pricing. Government contractors who inflated Bolivar-denominated invoices can no longer play the spread. The short-term effect is economic chaos. Prices for basic goods spiked 60% in 4 days as merchants scrambled to recalibrate. The transitional government imposed emergency price controls on food and medicine, but enforcement is impossible when the police haven't been paid in weeks. Riots erupted in Maracaibo on January 17th, with crowds looting supermarkets not out of political motivation but simple hunger and rage at suddenly unaffordable prices. The American economic team is accelerating the direct cash transfer program to counteract the crisis. $50 monthly payments to every Venezuelan adult, distributed via digital wallets to bypass the corrupt banking system. That's $580 million monthly, funded by oil revenue that won't materialize for months. The gap is being covered by U.S. Treasury advances, effectively loans against future Venezuelan production. Critics call it debt imperialism. Defenders argue it's the only way to prevent complete societal breakdown while the oil sector rebuilds. Either way, Venezuela is now fiscally dependent on American capital in ways that will take years to unwind. On January 19th, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen delivered carefully parsed remarks from Brussels that neither endorsed nor condemned the American operation. She emphasized the need for international legal frameworks and multilateral solutions, but stopped short of demanding us withdraw. This rhetorical gymnastics reflects Europe's uncomfortable position, ideologically opposed to unilateral intervention, but desperately interested in the outcome. Europe imports 450,000 barrels of Venezuelan crude daily in pre-Chavez years. By 2025, that number reached 0. The continent's energy security strategy post-Ukraine has been diversification away from Russian supplies, and a rebuilt Venezuela represents exactly the kind of Atlantic Basin alternative European refiners need. Behind the public statements, quiet negotiations are underway. Spain's Repsol, which abandoned Venezuelan operations in 2021 after expropriations and unpaid debts, is exploring whether the new Reconstruction Authority will honor old contracts or create new bidding processes. France's TotalEnergies is conducting preliminary assessments of offshore blocks in the Orinoco Belt. Germany is offering technical expertise in refinery modernization, positioning itself as a neutral partner that can work with both American administrators and Venezuelan nationals. Europe wants to have maintained sufficient diplomatic distance to avoid blame. Its hedging elevated to foreign policy doctrine, and it's working precisely as intended. On January 22nd, the OPEC Plus ministerial meeting in Vienna descended into barely concealed acrimony. Saudi Energy Minister Prince Abdulaziz bin Salman opened with diplomatic language about market stability, but the subtext was unmistakable. A rebuilt Venezuela pumping 2 million barrels daily within 3 years represents a direct threat to the cartel's pricing power. The mathematics are straightforward. Global oil demand grows roughly 1 million barrels annually, meaning Venezuelan production gains translate almost directly into Saudi, Iraqi, or Kuwaiti production cuts, if prices are to remain stable. The kingdom has spent 2 years trying to defend $80 per barrel Brent crude through coordinated supply restrictions. A flood of Western Hemisphere heavy crude undermines that entire strategy. The fracture lines within OPEC are deepening along predictable axes. The UAE, with its diversified economy and massive sovereign wealth reserves, can tolerate lower prices and is quietly supportive of increased global supply that damages higher-cost producers. Iraq and Iran, desperate for revenue to fund government operations, want maximum production regardless of price. Russia, technically OPEC rather than OPEC proper, faces its own calculation. Lower oil prices hurt state revenues, but they also damage American shale producers, who need $60 per barrel to break even. If Venezuelan oil helps crash prices to $55, it might force consolidation in Texas and North Dakota. On January 28th, the first supertanker in 4 years departed Venezuelan waters carrying American-supervised crude bound for refineries in Louisiana. The cargo was modest 420,000 barrels, barely a drop in global markets that consume 102 million barrels daily, but the symbolism was absolute. This single shipment represents the first tangible result of the most audacious American geopolitical gamble since the Iraq invasion. Unlike Iraq, where objectives shifted from weapons of mass destruction to democracy promotion to counter, the Venezuelan operation has crystalline clarity: restore oil production, stabilize the country enough to prevent refugee flows, and reassert Western Hemisphere dominance. The timeline is compressed, the stakes are quantifiable, and the metrics for success or failure are brutally objective. The nightmare scenarios remain unresolved. Cartel violence can make border regions ungovernable, forcing a choice between massive troop deployments or accepting limited geographic control. Currency stabilization could fail, triggering hyperinflation that direct cash payments cannot offset. The military command structure could fracture, with generals in Caracas negotiating while regional commanders operate as autonomous warlords. Russia or China could weaponize Venezuela's $77 billion in combined debt, demanding immediate payment and forcing sovereign asset seizures that paralyze the government. The reconstructed oil infrastructure could become a target for sabotage from ideological Chavistas who view American involvement as occupation. Yet the optimistic pathway exists. If production reaches 1.5 million barrels by 2028, if the revenue formula generates $30 billion annually, if half of that flows into Venezuelan reconstruction and citizen payments, the country could achieve economic stabilization that has eluded it for 20 years. The Trump administration is betting that geopolitical boldness, plus petroleum, engineering competence, can succeed where sanctions and diplomacy failed. The world is watching Venezuela to see whether American power in 2026 can still reshape nations, or whether this operation becomes the moment historians mark as imperial overreach.